In the bustling metropolis of New York City, where dreams are made and broken, the political landscape has always been as dynamic as the city itself. One figure who rose prominently in this arena was Eric Adams. His journey from a Brooklyn native to the mayoralty was emblematic of the quintessential New York story, a narrative of resilience, ambition, and the complexities that come with power. Eric Adams was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. His upbringing in a working-class family instilled in him a deep understanding of the challenges faced by everyday New Yorkers. This perspective guided his early career choices, leading him to join the New York City Police Department, NYPD. During his tenure, Adams became known for advocating against police brutality and for reforms within the department. His commitment to justice and equity resonated with many, laying the foundation for his subsequent political career. After retiring from the NYPD, Adams transitioned into politics. He served as a state senator for Brooklyn and later as the Brooklyn Borough president. In these roles, he championed issues such as public safety, affordable housing, and community development. His pragmatic approach and ability to connect with diverse communities bolstered his popularity, setting the stage for a mayoral run. In 2021, amidst a crowded field of candidates, Adams secured the Democratic nomination and went on to win the general election, becoming the 110th mayor of New York City. His victory was historic, marking him as the second African-American to hold the office. New Yorkers looked to Adams with hope, anticipating a leader who could bridge divides and usher the city into a new era of prosperity and unity. However, the optimism surrounding Adams's tenure began to wane as allegations of corruption surfaced. Reports indicated that as Brooklyn Borough president and during his mayoral campaign, Adams had accepted luxury travel and other benefit from Turkish nationals seeking to influence his political decisions. These allegations suggested a pattern of quid pro quo arrangements, where favors were exchanged for political support and access. The situation escalated in September 2024 when Adams was indicted on federal charges, including bribery, fraud, and soliciting foreign campaign donations. The indictment alleged that Adams had received luxury travel and other benefits from Turkish individuals, including a government official and several businessmen. In return, he purportedly used his influence to expedite approvals for a Turkish consulate building in Manhattan, bypassing standard safety inspections. These revelations sent shockwaves through the city's political establishment and eroded public trust in his leadership. Despite the gravity of the charges, Adams remained defiant. He vehemently denied any wrongdoing, labeling the accusations as baseless and politically motivated. In public statements, he framed himself as a victim of a smear campaign, asserting that his efforts to address systemic issues in the city had made him a target. This stance resonated with some of his supporters, who viewed the indictment with skepticism, but it did little to quell the growing calls for his resignation. As the scandal unfolded, attention turned to New York Governor Kathy Hochul. The state constitution endowed her with the authority to remove the mayor from office under specific circumstances. However, exercising this power was unprecedented and fraught with political implications. Hochul faced a dilemma: act decisively to restore integrity to the office or respect the electoral mandate that had placed Adams in power. Governor Hochul opted for a measured approach. Rather than pursuing immediate removal, she proposed implementing oversight measures to curtail Adams's authority. These guardrails included appointing a state inspector general to monitor the mayor's activities and enhancing the powers of the state comptroller to audit city finances. Hochul's strategy aimed to balance the need for accountability with the principles of democratic governance, ensuring that any action taken was both justified and proportionate. The allegations against Adams and the subsequent legal proceedings had a profound impact on public perception. Polls indicated that a significant majority of New Yorkers believed Adams had engaged in illegal activities and supported his resignation. This sentiment was not confined to the general populace. Numerous political figures, including members of his own party, distanced themselves from the embattled mayor. The scandal also had broader political ramifications. Former Governor Andrew Cuomo, who had resigned in 2021 amid his own controversies, announced his candidacy for the mayoralty. Cuomo's entry into the race added a new layer of complexity to the political landscape as voters grappled with issues of trust, redemption, and leadership. His candidacy was met with mixed reactions, reflecting the polarized views on his previous tenure and the current state of the city's governance. As the legal battle ensued, unexpected developments further complicated the narrative. In February 2025, the Department of Justice, under the Trump administration, directed federal prosecutors to seek dismissal of the charges against Adams. The rationale provided centered on concerns that the prosecution was hindering Adams's ability to govern effectively, particularly in addressing pressing issues like immigration and crime. This decision was met with widespread criticism and suspicion. Observers questioned the timing and motivation behind the move, suggesting potential political interference. The controversy deepened when several Justice Department officials, including the U.S. attorney overseeing the case, resigned in protest, citing ethical concerns and alleging undue influence from higher authorities. The attempt to dismiss the charges did not bring the clarity Adams might have hoped for. A federal judge ordered a hearing to scrutinize the rationale behind the dismissal request, prolonging the legal uncertainty surrounding the mayor's future. Meanwhile, Governor Hochul's proposed oversight measures faced resistance in the state legislature, with critics arguing that they were either insufficient or overreaching. As New York City approached the next mayoral election, the atmosphere was charged with tension and uncertainty. The electorate was confronted with challenging questions about leadership, accountability, and the path forward for a city beset by scandal. The saga of Eric Adams served as a poignant reminder of the complexities inherent in political life and the delicate balance between power, responsibility, and public trust. The rise and fall of Eric Adams encapsulate a turbulent chapter in New York City's history. From his ascent as a reform-minded police officer to his tenure as mayor marred by allegations of corruption, Adams's story is a testament to the volatile nature of politics. As the city stands at a crossroads, the lessons learned from this episode will undoubtedly shape its future governance and the expectations placed upon those who seek to lead. The rhythm of New York City had always been relentless, an unstoppable force of ambition and movement. But in the days following the allegations against its mayor, the city seemed to shift into an uneasy quiet. Beneath the surface, a storm had been brewing, one that threatened to dismantle the very foundation of leadership that Eric Adams had so carefully constructed over the years. Once a symbol of progress and reform, Adams now found himself at the center of a scandal that was impossible to ignore. The first signs of trouble emerged in the form of whispers. Conversations held in hushed tones among political insiders, anonymous tips reaching investigative journalists, and quiet acknowledgments in the corridors of power. The allegations alone would have been damning, but the weight of evidence that began to accumulate was far more dangerous. Documents leaked to the press detailed a complex network of transactions, campaign donations, and personal favors that painted a troubling picture of a leader entangled in ethically questionable dealings. The name of a foreign government surfaced repeatedly in the reports, drawing concern from federal investigators who had been tracking suspicious financial activity linked to political figures in the city. As the revelations mounted, public perception began to shift. In a city known for its sharp political instincts, support could dissolve as quickly as it had formed, and Adams was no exception. His reputation, once that of a pragmatic leader with a vision for safer streets and stronger communities, now bore the stain of corruption. The press coverage was relentless, each headline more damning than the last, each article dissecting a different aspect of the growing scandal. Political analysts speculated on the long-term consequences, while his most ardent supporters found themselves forced to either defend his actions or distance themselves entirely. The investigation had gained traction and alarming speed. What had initially appeared to be isolated incidents of financial mismanagement soon unraveled into a far-reaching inquiry that touched multiple branches of government. Federal prosecutors delved into his campaign finances, scrutinizing the flow of money from foreign donors and business interests that had allegedly sought to influence city policies. Investigators traced the origins of large campaign contributions, uncovering a network of shell companies and intermediaries designed to obscure the identities of those funding his rise to power. New Yorkers had seen corruption scandals before, but the sheer scope of this case made it impossible to dismiss as mere political maneuvering. The mayor's office issued statements of denial, attempting to frame the accusations as politically motivated attacks orchestrated by his rivals. But as subpoenas were issued and key figures within his administration were called to testify, the defenses grew weaker. Every passing day brought new disclosures, deepening the crisis that threatened to consume his administration. As pressure mounted, city officials found themselves facing a dilemma. A mayor under federal investigation could not effectively govern, yet Adams remained defiant, refusing to step down. His stance ignited a fierce debate among city leaders and state officials. Governor Kathy Hochul, under pressure to act, was forced to consider her options. The prospect of removing a sitting mayor was unprecedented in modern city politics, and any move against him would carry political ramifications that extended far beyond the 5 boroughs. Public opinion fractured. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, some demanding his resignation, others insisting that he be given the chance to defend himself in court. The city's deep divisions were laid bare as different communities reacted in starkly contrasting ways. In some neighborhoods, longtime supporters of Adams saw the investigation as an attack on a leader who had fought for their interests. In others, his presence was now seen as an embarrassment, a reminder of the systemic corruption that many had long suspected but never fully confronted. The weight of the accusations had transformed the city's political climate overnight. Allies within his own party distanced themselves, aware of the growing damage his presence in office was causing. Donors withdrew their support, eager to avoid any association with the scandal. Members of the city council, once steadfast in their alliances, began publicly discussing contingency plans should Adams be forced to step down. The machinery of government had been disrupted, and no one could predict what would come next. Despite the mounting evidence, Adams remained resolute. He made public appearances, his speeches filled with defiance, framing himself as the victim of a conspiracy aimed at undermining his leadership. His refusal to yield only deepened the divide, hardening the resolve of both his detractors and his remaining supporters. But beneath the surface, the reality was inescapable. The investigation was closing in, and the walls of power that had once seemed impenetrable were beginning to crack. The city pulsed with an undercurrent of tension as the investigation into Eric Adams deepened. Every day, new revelations surfaced, painting an increasingly damning picture of a mayor whose career was now defined not by policy achievements, but by scandal. Federal investigators had moved beyond campaign finance violations and were now examining his administration's dealings with real estate developers, city contractors, and international entities that had suspiciously secured lucrative deals under his leadership. The financial transactions were labyrinthine, designed to be difficult to trace, but forensic accountants working with federal prosecutors had begun to unravel the threads. Donations funneled through obscure nonprofit organizations linked back to foreign interests. Unusually fast-tracked approvals for major development projects pointed to possible backdoor agreements. Certain firms had miraculously bypassed regulatory hurdles that others spent years navigating. The pattern was clear. Money flowed in, favors were granted, and the power of the mayor's office was leveraged in ways that benefited a select few at the expense of the city. As the weight of the investigation bore down, Adams projected an air of defiance. His speeches grew more impassioned, his public appearances more theatrical. He framed the allegations as a witch hunt, an attack on his character orchestrated by those who feared his success. He railed against the media, condemning what he called sensationalism and political bias. He pointed fingers at state and federal officials, suggesting that they were using him as a scapegoat for their own failures. Yet, for all his bluster, the tide had turned against him. His inner circle was fracturing. Aides who once stood loyally beside him now found themselves under subpoena, facing questions about their own involvement in the unfolding scandal. Some cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for leniency, providing damning testimony that implicated Adams in direct conversations about financial transactions and political favors. Leaked transcripts of these testimonies found their way into the press, each disclosure dealing another blow to an administration struggling to maintain control over the narrative. The public, once divided on the issue, was now growing restless. New Yorkers had always been resilient, but their patience for political corruption had limits. The mayor's approval ratings plummeted. His once-packed town halls were now sparsely attended, filled with more protesters than supporters. Calls for his resignation intensified, with city leaders publicly debating the next course of action. Editorial boards across major newspapers called for him to step down, arguing that his ability to govern had been irreparably compromised. Governor Kathy Hochul, who had remained measured in her statements at the onset of the scandal, could no longer ignore the growing crisis. Legal teams examined the mechanisms for removing a sitting mayor, a move that had little precedent but was increasingly seen as necessary. Behind closed doors, discussions took on a more urgent tone. Would Adams be forced out by the state? Would he be arrested while still in office? What would happen to city governance in the event of an unprecedented removal? Even within the city's power structure, the ground was shifting. The city council, hesitant at first, began exploring paths to impeachment. Key figures within the Democratic Party, once reluctant to alienate a high-profile mayor, were now abandoning him altogether. His political allies grew scarce, his fundraising efforts dried up, and endorsements that once legitimized his leadership had vanished. The final blow came when federal agents executed a search warrant on properties linked to the investigation. Documents, hard drives, and confidential communications were seized, their contents unknown to the public, but undeniably significant. The optics of the raid alone sent shockwaves through the city. For the first time, even Adams' most loyal supporters began to question whether their faith in him had been misplaced. Despite the overwhelming evidence, despite the growing certainty of legal consequences, he refused to step down. His defiance became his defining trait, an unrelenting resistance that bordered on desperation. The city braced itself for the next chapter, knowing that whatever happened next would alter the course of New York politics for years to come. The question was no longer whether Adams would fall, but how long he could hold on before the inevitable collapse. The city moved like an unrelenting machine, indifferent to the personal battles of the individuals who claimed to lead it. But beneath its usual rhythm, there was an undeniable shift. The scandal that had begun as whispers in political circles had now engulfed every corner of public discourse. The case against Eric Adams had become more than just an investigation. It was a reckoning. Federal prosecutors had built their case meticulously, tracing financial transactions across borders, connecting anonymous donors to international players, and linking seemingly ordinary development deals to hidden influences. The evidence they had compiled was damning. A network of shell companies funneled money through undisclosed accounts. City contracts were awarded at record speed, bypassing standard review procedures. Millions in campaign funds, initially attributed to grassroots donations, were now revealed to have been laundered through corporate entities with no clear ownership. The connections to foreign governments were particularly explosive. Adams' administration had aggressively pushed for economic partnerships with select international firms, often with minimal oversight. It had once been framed as a push for global investment in New York, but now it appeared to be something far more sinister. The documents seized in the latest round of federal searches revealed confidential communications, records of meetings, and agreements that pointed to one conclusion. The mayor was not merely accepting money, he was compromised. The reactions within the government were swift and severe. Governor Kathy Hochul, under increasing pressure from both state and national leaders, was forced to take a stand. She convened emergency meetings with legal advisors and political allies, discussing the potential consequences of taking decisive action. New York had never removed a sitting mayor under such circumstances, but the moment was unprecedented. The longer Adams remained in office, the more damage was inflicted on the city's governance, and the deeper the embarrassment became for those in power. The New York City Council, previously hesitant to openly challenge the mayor, now acted with a newfound urgency. City Hall was in chaos, staffers resigning, administration officials distancing themselves, departments struggling to operate under the weight of uncertainty. The council prepared measures that could strip Adams of key powers, effectively rendering him a figurehead while investigations concluded. There were even early discussions about invoking charter provisions that would allow for a special election if he was removed. Public outrage had reached a boiling point. The protests outside City Hall grew larger each day, with thousands gathering to demand his resignation. Activist groups, once divided on his policies, had found common ground in their demand for accountability. The city's newspapers ran scathing editorials, questioning how much longer he could withstand the inevitable. Late-night television hosts mocked his increasingly unhinged public statements, where he claimed to be the victim of a coordinated attack by political elites who feared his leadership. Behind the scenes, Adams' legal team worked desperately to slow the collapse. They attempted to challenge search warrants, suppress evidence, and question the legitimacy of key witnesses. They floated theories about prosecutorial overreach, suggesting that the investigation was politically motivated. Yet, none of it could change the reality of the situation. More than a dozen individuals tied to his administration had already been indicted. Business executives, political consultants, and city officials were either testifying against him or bracing for their own legal battles. Then came the leaks. Internal memos from within the mayor's office painted a picture of an administration in full-blown crisis mode. Advisors had warned Adams months earlier that certain financial dealings were under scrutiny. Instead of adjusting course, he had doubled down, pressuring city officials to accelerate projects linked to his donors. Emails showed internal concerns about the legality of campaign finance activities. Confidential briefings described how his office attempted to suppress whistleblower complaints. The situation had reached a critical point. Adams' presence in City Hall was now untenable. Each day he remained in office added to the spectacle of a government that had ceased to function effectively. The governor's office faced mounting pressure to intervene. The Justice Department had reportedly been briefed on the possibility of removing Adams under emergency provisions if his continued defiance resulted in further disruption. Then, in a dramatic escalation, a grand jury returned multiple indictments against Adams himself. The charges were extensive: bribery, conspiracy, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. The announcement sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Sitting mayors had faced scandals before, but none had been indicted on charges of this magnitude while still in office. The courtroom was now inevitable. Federal prosecutors laid out a roadmap for their case, signaling that the trial would be one of the most high-profile political corruption cases in decades. It would be televised, dissected, and debated endlessly. It would define not just Adams' legacy, but the entire political apparatus that had enabled his rise. Despite the mountain of evidence, despite the nearly universal condemnation, Adams still refused to step down. His remaining supporters rallied behind him, convinced that he was the victim of a deep state plot designed to remove an outsider who had challenged the establishment. Political commentators debated whether he was delusional, desperate, or strategically stalling for leverage in potential plea negotiations. The city was now in a state of paralysis. The mayor was under indictment, but still in office. The governor was weighing intervention, but faced constitutional roadblocks. The council was preparing emergency measures, but lacked full consensus. The situation had become a legal and political nightmare, with no clear resolution in sight. New York had seen its fair share of scandals, but this was something else entirely. The fall of Eric Adams was unfolding in real time, each development more surreal than the last. The city braced itself for the next move, knowing that whatever happened next would be historic. The final collapse was approaching, but no one knew exactly when or how it would arrive. The only certainty was that New York would not emerge from this crisis unchanged. The tension in New York City had reached an unbearable peak. The mayor's office was in complete disarray. City agencies were struggling to function, and the weight of Adams' defiance had begun to drag the entire administration into a constitutional crisis. The grand jury indictments had confirmed what many had long suspected. This was no mere case of political opportunism or media exaggeration. The charges were specific, detailed, and devastating. Bribery, conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice. The mayor of New York City, once a symbol of reform and progress, was now the face of corruption at its most audacious. The Justice Department wasted no time laying out its next steps. The prosecution's case was built on a mountain of evidence: bank records, email correspondences, testimony from former allies who had turned against him in exchange for leniency. The timeline of the corruption scheme became clear. Adams had leveraged his office, both as Brooklyn Borough President and later as mayor, to facilitate lucrative deals for his donors. In exchange, campaign funds were funneled to him through a labyrinth of shadow entities. Foreign interests had been granted privileged access to city contracts. Development projects had been pushed through the system with remarkable speed, bypassing traditional review processes. Public confidence had disintegrated entirely. The streets of New York, always alive with energy, now carried a different kind of electricity. The protests outside City Hall grew larger, more organized, more determined. Each day, activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens gathered in mass demonstrations, demanding his resignation. The pressure on the city council had reached a breaking point. Their deliberations had now moved beyond discussions. They were drafting articles of impeachment. But Adams remained immovable. He issued statements proclaiming his innocence, delivering fiery speeches that bordered on delusional. He insisted he was being targeted by political elites who wanted to silence him. He refused to acknowledge the evidence. He called the grand jury process a sham. He accused the federal government of overreach. He made wild claims about a coordinated effort to dismantle his administration because he had been a champion for working-class New Yorkers. The governor's office was now fully engaged in damage control. Hochul, reluctant at first to wade into the crisis, had no choice but to consider executive intervention. Meetings with legal teams had grown more frequent, more urgent. The pressure from Albany, Washington, and city officials was becoming unbearable. The chaos in City Hall was not just a political embarrassment, it was a governmental catastrophe. There was no clear legal precedent for removing a sitting mayor who refused to resign amid criminal charges. The city's charter provided no simple path forward. Every option carried risk. The White House had begun quietly weighing in behind the scenes. The crisis had spiraled beyond just city or state politics. It was now a national embarrassment. A major American city could not function under a leader facing federal indictment. The Department of Justice signaled that additional charges could be coming. The gravity of the situation demanded action, and yet, Adams refused to give an inch. Inside his administration, the collapse was accelerating. More resignations, more staffers receiving subpoenas. The once loyal team that had built his political career was abandoning ship. Former confidants were now appearing in court, striking deals with prosecutors, providing testimony that further incriminated him. Those who had once defended him publicly were now silent, unwilling to attach themselves to a sinking political entity. Then, in an unprecedented move, the New York City Council convened an emergency session. The hearing was broadcast across major networks, and the city watched as council members debated the most drastic measure ever considered: the forcible removal of a sitting mayor. Legal experts were brought in. Constitutional scholars weighed in on the ramifications. The session lasted for hours, the arguments growing more intense with each passing moment. The council could strip Adams of certain executive powers, but could they remove him outright? Did the governor have the authority to override city leadership in the interest of stability? Could federal intervention be justified under constitutional grounds? The uncertainty only added to the chaos. What was clear, however, was that the city could not continue like this for much longer. Then came the final, irrevocable moment. A federal arrest warrant was issued. The Department of Justice, having exhausted all avenues of negotiation, made its move. U.S. Marshals, alongside federal agents, arrived at City Hall in the early hours of the morning, executing what would become one of the most surreal moments in New York's political history. The mayor of New York City, still seated in office, was being taken into custody. The images were broadcast live across the nation. Adams, dressed in his signature tailored suit, walking out of City Hall, flanked by federal agents, his expression defiant but hollow. The city watched in stunned silence as he was placed into an unmarked vehicle, the doors closing behind him. In a single instant, the reign of Eric Adams was effectively over. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. City officials scrambled to stabilize governance. Acting leadership was appointed. Statements were issued assuring New Yorkers that essential services would not be disrupted. The governor's office moved swiftly to re-establish control, ensuring that the city would not descend into further disarray. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy and exhaustive. The trial was the most watched in the country. Witnesses took the stand. Financial records were displayed in court. Prosecutors laid out a case so comprehensive that it left no doubt about the depth of Adams' corruption. The defense attempted to paint him as a victim of political persecution, but the evidence was overwhelming. New York City, despite its resilience, had been shaken. The entire political landscape had shifted. The scandal had exposed deep fractures in the city's governance, raising questions about oversight, accountability, and the mechanisms that allowed such corruption to flourish for so long. The damage was not just political, it was institutional. Trust had been shattered. But, as it always had, the city moved forward. Leadership changed. Policies were re-examined. Investigations expanded to ensure that the network of corruption Adams had built would not persist beyond his removal. Eric Adams' name became synonymous with one of the greatest political falls in modern history. What had begun as an ambitious journey of public service had ended in disgrace. The final chapter of his story was not just about his downfall. It was about a city that refused to be held hostage by corruption. A city that, despite the failures of its leaders, endured. A city that, even in its darkest moments, found a way to rebuild.